Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm Christian. If you haven't come to one of these classes before, so glad that you are here. These are a lot of fun. I really enjoy the shorter format. In January this year, we did a lot of CE classes for the new contracts, and that is actually available to all of you to watch if you haven't already on my YouTube channel. So if you want to look at those videos, they're there. They're a lot of fun. In fact, I'm going to put a link in the chat and you can go to all the videos. So going back to last year, we have videos about legal descriptions. We have videos about option money, which we're going to talk about slightly here, talk about fix and flips and how you partner with people and LLCs and just kind of like some fun, individual specific topics that are, hopefully something that you're interested in. And you don't have to sit through a 3-hour class to get one or two pieces that you were most interested in. And that's what today's class is all about. We have these long format 3-hour CE classes for multiple offers and how you handle, best and highest and how you kind of coordinate with other agents and how you, decline counter offers and things like that. And I actually have one of those classes on the YouTube channel. So feel free to watch that or join into the next CE class that I teach about that. But this one is something I think I'm getting phone calls about this 3-4 times a day. Escalation clauses. What about this? How do I insert this? How do I get my contract to the top of the heap? Or alternatively, how do I protect my seller? And then, so those are the goals 1 and goal number 2. Goal number 3, get it closed. And we can't focus entirely on goal number 1, goal number 2 to the detriment of goal number 3, which is get it closed. Get it closed. So some of you are already paying attention to the YouTube channel, and honestly, I only use it so that you guys can watch these classes after the fact. If there's something you want, you can use it at any time. If you're not dealing with, say, option money today, but you are in 3 months, you could go back to it. And that's what it's meant for. But ultimately, feel free to email me. I would love to have an interaction with you guys individually. And a lot of you I do. So without further ado, the slides for this handout, I'm going to send it to you after class. I'll actually put it into the chat feature at some point, but it was all in the email. So in the email, next to the registration button was a link so that you could download the handout and, print it out, put it in a little binder. In fact, what I do is all my handouts I have in my binder, including the most recent CE class that we did. So if I need to go back to something, if I need to reference it, it's really easily available to me. So thinking about escalation clauses, and here's right from the handout. When the situation arises, you may need an escalation clause and then some. And that's the reality of what we're dealing today. Escalation clause isn't enough sometimes. So what can we do to kind of tweak it and hopefully achieve some of our goals? This class discusses and provides an escalation clause for you to use. You can copy it, you can paste it, as well as discuss several other techniques available to hopefully get under contract. Ultimately, the choices you make will have varying degrees of success based on your intended goals. They are not perfect. You can't shoot yourself in the foot achieving goal number 1, which is getting under contract, only to have to terminate during due diligence or lose some sort of option money. I've seen a couple of people in the chat feature. Stacy says she was unable to download the handout in advance. For some reason, it got blocked on my computer, so she'll be on the lookout. So yes, I'll send it to all of you. I'm gonna make sure that I email each of you individually after this class, and I'll make sure that you have that as an attachment. So here's an escalation clause for you to use. You may have one that you already use, but let's look at just individual pieces. I'm not married to mine. Yours might be better, but what I do want to ensure that we have, in the very least, is kind of the minimum standards of what an escalation clause needs to be. So let's see if I can share my screen. In the event of multiple offers, buyer agrees to pay X more, contemplating purchase price and buyer concession, so your net, than any other offer presented to the seller with comparable terms and conditions, so long as the other offer is an arm's length transaction and is presented to the seller before the offer deadline date. So we're really trying to protect the buyer in this case and say, look, we're talking about net. We're not saying that the other buyer's paying $600 but taking a $10,000 credit. I'm saying when the net is $600, that's what I'm escalating against, and that it's a valid offer, that you could actually accept it. It hasn't, terminated or expired. In no event shall buyer pay more than X. So the first part, we're establishing the net piece of it. That it's arm's length transaction, so it's not an aunt or an uncle with a different last name. But then the second part is a cap, a ceiling. Now, some people don't put the cap in there, which is fine. You could remove the cap portion, but it's going to cause problems for your buyer if we use some of the other techniques, such as removing a due diligence period, or putting in non-refundable option money. You're shooting yourself in the foot if you have no cap and now you have all this money that has to go down non-refundable and you can't close. So be careful. I think a cap is the way I would do it. Listing agents shall notify the selling agent of the highest offer, and we may actually want to change the naming of the parties, because in 2021 GAR changed all the names: buyer broker, seller broker. So I may need to change this. And upon receipt of such notice, buyer shall execute an addendum to this offer reflecting the final purchase price and amount of buyer concessions within X days. So let's put a time limit on it. Buyer shall have the right, but not the obligation, or buyer may request that the broker of the listing agent verbally confirm with the broker of the selling agent, such as competing highest offers, and is upon comparable terms and conditions. Comparable terms and conditions shall mean similar contingency requirements, similar requests for seller concessions, and ability to close in a similar time frame. This does not in any way bind or obligate the buyer to counter upon receipt of any other offer. So the second half of that section, what it really establishes is how we verify. We need to have the right to verify that we can confirm this other offer. And that is part that is really challenging, really challenging. So obviously, what does this achieve? It achieves goal number one: get it under contract. That's the only reason for an escalation clause. It is confusing. It's extensive in kind of the legalese. There's this and there's that, but it can get you under contract. And that's kind of, the point of this is, whenever you ask an attorney for one of these escalation clauses, we say, well, we don't like them, but here you go, because it achieves that goal. We understand the goal. So if you look at the bottom here, side note, verifying the other offer. Now, I've written my special step in comparison to how I like to verify the offer. So options include getting a copy of the other offers in, some sort of, whited out version of it, redacted version, or written confirmation from the seller broker. So basically the broker is sending an email saying, these were the terms of the other offers. And that, to me, that's great. I love that. Or confirmation with a third party, such as the actual broker. That's the part I probably like the best. And there is a new form that GAR put out this year. I think it's F289. I think it's 289, and that it's basically verification of, that the seller broker presented the offer, something like that. And that, that's another thing that you potentially could share with the parties. So my special stip is written in the sense that I like to verbally confirm with either the agent or their broker. And I don't want to see anything in writing other than maybe an email detailing all the other offers. So an email is great, but I may call your broker. So my next door neighbor, Jim Glover, is at Atlanta Fine Homes. I'm going to use him in my example. We had a buyer make an escalation clause. The listing agent was one of his agents, and the buyer's agent was just concerned of verifying what it was. And instead of asking for copies of those contracts where it's all whited out and you can't really verify if it's third party or not, this agent actually called Jim and said, Jim, one of your agents is doing multiple offers and it's, it's very confusing. Can you verify for me what the next highest offer is? And, could you put that in an email? And I thought that was lovely. I thought that was great. Of course, Jim said yes, as any of the brokers around here do. It's a great way to do it because the broker has less incentive to lie or mislead another party just to get it under contract because they have so many, they have the bigger picture in mind. So, and so Brenda brings up a really good point about this. I just had an agent lie to me about what they had and wanted me to show her highest price and not show me the offer. She did not have an offer. And Brenda, what I would be curious about is how you actually found out that information, because that's the scariest part. When do you realize this? Do you realize it when it's too late? Did you realize it kind of gut feeling ahead of time and then you investigated it further? And there's no perfect situation to this, but you do have to go with your gut. And ultimately, the buyer has to be comfortable with the price that they're paying. You can be manipulated. These things could be really tough. Man, that's brutal. So, and then let's think of it from a different perspective. Someone was asking, what if we look at this from the seller's perspective? How do we interpret one of these offers? How do we make sense of it? And actually, it's pretty simple. I'm going to look it over and I'm going to verify it compared to what the next offer and just see, hey, does this actually go up? Is this valid? Is this well written? Does this make sense? If I had someone recently ask me to simplify an escalation clause, and I really was hesitant to do that because all the items that are in here really kind of need to be in there. If we leave stuff out, do I have the right to verbally confirm with the broker about the validity of other offers? Maybe you do. Maybe it's implied, maybe it's assumed, but that's a tough one. I'd rather just be in there. The cap, maybe you don't need it in there if you have a due diligence period. You could leave that out. You could always terminate, or, oh my gosh, it got $10,000 higher than I expected. Now I have a decision to make. That's fine. You could remove the cap. You could remove the verbal offer thing. You could remove, some of this third party language, I suppose, as long as you had a way to get out later. Now, here's someone else that says the seller doesn't want to deal with escalation clauses because it comes too cumbersome. So what do you recommend putting in FMLS private remarks to let buyers know to make their best offer and seller choose from one of those? Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. How do we get in front of this so that we don't even have to worry about escalation clauses? You could do a private remarks. I think that's probably the best and only way you could do it. Because a lot of times the buyers are not reaching out to you ahead of time before making their offer. Maybe they are, maybe it's 50-50, where they're going to reach out and say, hey, we're going to make an offer, it's coming your way. And you could say, hey, just so you know, we don't like escalation clauses. It confuses my client. Just make your strongest offer. I've already gotten 5 other calls. It will be competing offers. Now, I can't prevent a buyer from giving you an escalation clause anyway, and you obviously have to share that with your seller anyways. But if you've disclosed that this could negatively impact your chances at winning the closing or the contract, then yeah, that you probably will convince other people to walk away from that. Debbie says, I just held a highest and best by 6 p.m. Does the escalation clause follow that guideline? It can. So you could give a highest and best with an escalation clause. That's typically what happens. So you say, let's say all week and all weekend, you've been having people come to the house, you had broker opens, and, you tell everybody, maybe this is where you use private remarks to say, all offers should be in to the, seller broker no later than 6 p.m. on Sunday evening, at which time the seller intends to review all offers. Please make this your highest and best, so that we can avoid back and forth. And they will do that. They'll say, all right, I'm going to give you 250,000, but I'll escalate it and I'll go $1,000 more than anyone else up to 275. And then maybe they throw in some of this other stuff. So yeah, I love escalation clauses because it gets you the contract. I don't like escalation clauses because it confuses people. So let's look at the next piece here. In fact, we're going to skip all the way down. I should have done this in a different order. If you're going to do an escalation clause, if you're going to throw some of this different stuff in there, what I really want you to do is follow up once you get it under contract with a conforming copy and remove the escalation clause entirely. So we've achieved goal number one. We're under contract. Well, now goal number two, protect the seller, protect the buyer. Let's make sure we're all on the same page after a very confusing and hectic weekend. And so let's read what Special Stipulation 622 is. Now, before we get to that, actually, the F201, the contract, allows either party to request a conformed or clean copy of the agreement. So if we had an offer and then a counteroffer and then a counteroffer, and we had a bunch of exhibits, and then the exhibits changed, and there was an escalation clause and a, some sort of change in that, we can, either party can request that there be a conforming or clean copy of that agreement. Basically taking, 30 documents, combine it into one F201 form. Remove all the exhibits, remove all the counteroffers, and then just solidify it all into one. But when you do that, I want you to use 622, and this is a GAR special stipulation. It's in your indexes. So buyer and seller acknowledge that the above agreement is a conformed copy of an agreement between the parties dated, if it was last Sunday, it would be, let's say, last Sunday. In the event of any conflict between this conformed agreement and the original, all parties agree that the original agreement shall control. Let me give you the example. And this could happen even without an escalation clause. But you have the back and forth, you have counteroffer. We're just trying to get closer and closer to a number. And at the end of the day, the listing agent puts down in the final offer, which gets signed, that it would be a $590,000 purchase price with a zero in closing costs, right? But there were a million different counteroffers, and at one point it was $600,000 with $10,000 closing costs. It was $580 or $560. It was all over the place. Well, let's just clean it up. The lender asked for it to be clean. It's been a long week of negotiating. And this was a real story. And we get to the end, and she goes ahead and we does a clean copy of this agreement, or conforming copy. And they put $590,000 purchase price with a $10,000 closing credit by the seller. That's a $10,000 mistake. It should have been $590 with no closing costs, but instead we did $590 with $10,000 closing costs because we were going back so much, back and forth, back and forth. And now you have a signed copy. The buyer didn't notice that it was a mistake. The seller didn't notice it was a mistake. The agents didn't. That was a problem. Obviously, in that scenario, buyer and seller just re-signed. It had been, in a couple hours. They noticed it right away. All right, let's just get it. Let's fix it and let's move on. And you had a very reasonable buyer and a very reasonable seller. But if you had 622, there would have been no problems with that mistake. It would have been simplified very easy by saying, all right, there was a mistake. The original offer that was signed and dated last Sunday is the one that controls. So I love this step because you're bound to make a mistake like I do. In fact, that story is my story. That was a house that I bought, and I think negotiating took over 3 months or whatever it was. And we came up 30, they came down 100, or whatever it was. And at the end of the day, this would have really helped someone who maybe was a little less scrupulous or more scrupulous. So this is a good one. I like for you guys to use this one in addition to any sort of counteroffers and conform copy, because I want you to make sure that you're protected in the event you're just moving a little too fast and make an easy mistake. So the next thing that not many of you are aware of, so you've seen the escalation clauses. Let's say that is where your buyer wants to go. They'd love to be able to get it for $250, but they're willing to go up. But from a seller perspective, someone was asking this in the comments. How do I protect my seller? How do I know that this is legitimate? How do I distinguish one escalation clause from another? Well, ultimately it is, how much money does the buyer actually have? Because what's the number one thing that we are concerned about on an escalation clause? That it won't appraise. That is our number one concern. It won't appraise for enough for the buyer to actually close on the deal. So let's take that off the table. Let's see if we can protect our seller, protect the deal a little bit better by throwing in what I call the appraisal waiver. So there are two options. Option one is my favorite. So let's read it. And I usually put this right underneath the escalation special stipulation. It says, if the property appraises for less than the purchase price, but more than blank, buyer shall be deemed to have waived the appraisal contingency and shall fund the difference between the new loan amount and the purchase price. Option number two is when you're using it with an escalation clause and you may not know what the number is. So this one says, if the property appraises for not less than blank below the purchase price, so let's say it's $10,000, buyer shall be deemed to have waived the appraisal contingency, shall fund the difference between the new loan amount and the purchase price. Let me give you a scenario. $300,000 purchase price, $250,000 loan. So the lender is expecting the buyer to come up with 50 grand as equity. That's your normal deal. That's like a 15% down payment, something like that. Well, that was with an escalation clause and all these, that's a really high price. We're worried about the appraisal. And the buyer says, well, I could put more than $50,000 down. I could put, I could put 60 or I could put 70. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to put that number, the minimum that the appraisal needs to be, or the maximum that the buyer is willing to fund in addition to the appraisal amount. So in my scenario, let's say it instead appraises for $290,000. So now we've got a $10,000 gap. So originally the lender was going to give you $250,000 loan. Now it's going to be something less than that. It's going to be like 240 or 235. There, the loan comes down with the new purchase or the new appraised amount. So the lender now is going to give you, let's say, $240,000 because the appraisal was only 290, but the purchase price is still 300. And this seller knows we have a ton of other offers, and this buyer won an escalation clause above a cash purchaser and all these other things that may not have had this same appraisal issue. So in this scenario, the buyer already agreed to fund up to $10,000 if the appraisal didn't come in at that full purchase price. I love this step. I really love it because it is going to keep your deal together better. Now I don't have to be as worried about the appraisal. I just needed to hit a minimum 290. Maybe 290 was the list price, and we escalated all the way up to 300. And that gives me so much more confidence in the deal. And it allows also, let's say it came in at 285. Well, my seller may not have to come down the full 15,000 if they still wanted to close. Maybe the seller only has to come down 5,000. The buyer had already, told them that they could afford to go 10, and we make the deal happen. I love the appraisal waivers for you guys because that's that extra tweak that says, hey, I know we're coming up here, but my buyer is desperate. We want this house. Let's waive almost like a hybrid appraisal waiver with some real teeth. The buyer has agreed to pay up to $60,000 for their down payment, even though they would love to only have to pay $50,000. They've got the money. We're willing to do this. So here's the next, and that one achieves both goal number one and goal number two. So if you remember, goal number one is get it under contract. That's a sweet deal for the seller to be like, wow, this buyer's putting their money where their mouth is. And then goal number two is protect the seller. Let's keep the deal. Let's make sure these contingencies are less critical. So option money, this is the one I've been on, this soapbox for a year or so. So several years ago, GAR came out with the option money. This was before I was at Campbell and Brannan. I was doing other types of real estate. But apparently what was going on was that there were all these investors who were putting offers on properties. Maybe they're putting 5, 10, 15 offers on properties over a weekend and dropping most of them and keeping just the one or two good ones. And, these are as is, contracts. The due diligence period is maybe 5 or 10 days. There was no downside to them in doing it that way, because if they didn't want it, if they got all the other properties they wanted, they could just terminate, get all their earnest money back. So they incorporated option money. Option money is paid directly to the seller. It's not held by the broker or by the closing attorney. It's paid directly to the seller. And for the most part, it is non-refundable. And so let's look at section 8 of F201. This is the sales contract. And this is a little cutout of it. Inspection and due diligence. So due diligence period, you guys are all familiar with this. That is 8A. Property being sold subject to a due diligence period of blank days. So obviously, you know, you're playing with this number. Instead of asking for 10 or 14 days, we're down to 5 or 7 days. We'll look at 8B, option payment for due diligence period. So in consideration of seller granting buyer the option to terminate this agreement, buyer has paid $10, and that's the standard one. That's basically creating consideration. But we look at 8B2, seller pay or shall pay seller additional option money of blank by check or wire of immediately available funds, either right now as the offer date or within 3 business days, something like that, of the binding agreement date. Any additional option money paid by seller to buyer to seller shall or shall not be applied towards the purchase price at closing and shall not be refundable to buyer unless the closing fails to occur due to the seller's default. So let's think about that. You're buying that $300,000 house. You have an escalation clause that got you the deal. You've agreed to waive the appraisal contingency up to $10,000. So, hey, even if, as long as it appraises for at least $290, I'll waive my appraisal contingency. And then we've reduced our due diligence period from 10 days down to 7 or 6 or 4, whatever your time frame allows. And then 8B2, and not only am I going to give you, the $3,000 of earnest money that you were expecting, I'll give you another $3,000 as option money that I'll pay to your seller directly. And the seller can use that money to move, to put a down payment on something else, to pay themselves for the mortgage, whatever it is. And if I later terminate, you have the money. If the appraisal comes in at 285, right? And that's a very real situation. The appraisal comes in at 285, the buyer can't fund the difference, the seller won't reduce it because of all the interest. Well, now they have that $3,000 option money because the buyer's terminated. Buyer's going to walk away. They're going to keep their earnest money, but they don't get to keep their option money. Option money is paid. Whether they had the contingency or not, option money is paid. It's gone. Seller got paid that money to be off the market for 2, 3, 4 weeks. I really like option money. And what does this do? This achieves goal number 2. This protects our seller. This protects the seller. This makes sure that the buyer has something to lose in a good sense. And I say that to make sure that the buyer is legitimate, that the buyer is all in. Now, there are a couple options here. The amount and the timing of the option money. So the amount, let's talk about that first. It depends. You could do anything, but realize that it's non-refundable once it's paid. So only give it as much as you're willing to lose. So if you're going to buy a $300,000 house, maybe the option money is $1,500 and the earnest money, let's say the total, you were going to give them $5,000. Or that $10,000 that you said you could fund the difference on, you'll put that whole thing up as earnest money, right? So $10,000 is earnest money. Well, maybe we back out 2 of it, and now it's $8,000 earnest money and $2,000 is option money. Let's sweeten the pot a little bit for the seller without betting the whole farm, and that just gives my seller more confidence that you are legit. I'm getting $2,000 today. You've waived a portion of the appraisal contingency. So, you could walk if you can't afford it, but if you can afford it, we're here, we're in, we're all in. And I really like this one. And there's a lot we could go into, and I'm going to look at the questions in just a second and see where you guys are thinking on that. Let's get to the last option here. And this is the one I really don't want you guys messing with, because this is where it gets super dangerous. I don't think buyers really consider the consequences. And a lot of times I don't know if we're doing a good job explaining it to them. So be careful when doing this. May achieve goals 1 and 2, which is getting under contract and protecting your seller, but it has nothing to do with achieving goal number 3, which is to actually close. It does nothing towards actually closing. So let's talk about a couple of scenarios. We waive the sale or lease contingency. Sale or lease contingency is the thorn in everyone's side, especially in a hot market. Buyers, feel the need to be able to compete, that they can't have that in there. And I get it. I totally get it. But if you remove that and the buyer can't sell their other property, can they actually close? Probably not. They probably can't. The consequences of being in default on a purchase are that the brokers can sue for commission, the seller gets to keep earnest money, seller gets to keep option money. That is devastating. I mean, could you imagine, you go from living the high life, you went out on this big offer, multiple interested people on it, you've got an offer on your house, but it falls through, and then your purchase falls through, and you lose $15,000 of your hard-earned money, and it may set you back 12 months to get that money back to be able to buy something. That just sounds awful. So if we were instead doing it on my scenario that I talked about earlier, $300,000 purchase price, $8,000 earnest money, and $2,000 option money. We get through our due diligence, we get through our appraisal, get through our financing, and then the buyer backs out on our sale, right? The buyer backs out, I can't close anymore. By that point, the buyer can terminate and get their $8,000 back, and they would lose their $2,000 option money, which I think is fair. The seller deserves that money to pay their mortgage, to pay their moving expenses. And I call that being left at the altar. May not be enough in that scenario. Maybe it is. Maybe maybe 8 and 2 is the right fit if it's just due diligence, appraisal, and contingency. But if there's also a sale contingency, maybe you need to ask for $6,000 in option money, $4,000 in earnest money. Now let's move the tables. And you can see you have to sit with your seller and say, seller, if we get to day 45, their deal falls apart, what's going to make you okay? What's going to cover your expenses, your moving expenses, your mortgage, going back on the market, getting it restaged, whatever it may be? Is $6,000 enough? Is $9,000 enough? Is it 10? And ultimately we're trying to protect our buyer and our seller. We're trying to protect the buyer from being sued for commissions, being sued for earnest money or things like that. We're trying to protect the seller in their pocketbook to make sure that if they are left at the altar, it sounds awful, but it kind of drives the point home. If they're left at the altar, are they going to be okay? Are they going to be satisfied with what it is? So you've got your choices. We got goal number 1, get it under contract. But don't ignore goal number 2. You've got someone who's trying to protect their seller. And I think as the buyer's agent, you can consider that. You should consider what the seller is going to ask for, what they're going to need. And then obviously goal number 3, we need to be able to close this deal. How do we get to that point? So let me look at some of these questions. So Steve, good morning, buddy. Steve has a question. He says he had one that put in a stipulation that buyer's willing to pay up to X over appraised value, like the stipulation I gave. There were 15 offers, and this is what pushed the buyer ahead of the rest. House did appraise for less, and buyer was happy to pay the difference to get the home. That is spectacular. That's exactly the way the appraisal is supposed to be. And I promise you, all of you have this information now, but there are thousands of agents out there that don't realize that this is a thing. This could give you a little bit of peace. And it allows you to have a very honest and direct conversation with a buyer about what they can afford to lose, all of those things. So let's see. Other people have said, there's no way I'm submitting one of these without a clause that the offer I'm beating must be shown to me. I want a copy, not interested in anyone's word. Totally get it. That's a really good point. If that's what makes you satisfied, that is fine. I have no problem with that. Ultimately, it's not up to you in the sense of who makes the final decision. Is the buyer has to be accepting of it. If the buyer has a pit in their stomach saying, this doesn't feel right, it's too pricey, it doesn't matter what they show you, it's not going to work. But if the buyer is head over heels in this property and they don't care whether there was another offer or not, they're just happy to get it, we're not going to get in the middle of the deal either. That's going to be like a side thing where we complain to the ethics commission or something. There is a broker that I've talked to in the past that said what he used to request is that at closing, he wanted a copy of that other contract. I don't know about that. To me, what are you going to do? You're at closing. Buyer's going to walk, or are you just going to make an ethics complaint down at GREC after the fact, and maybe the buyer will have some sort of some sort of protection after the fact. I don't know. That's not enough for me. You get it during due diligence. Whatever you do, you and your buyer must be pleased, and that's fine by me. I have no problem with that. So here's an example. Binding offer had escalation clause with a cap at 965,000. Other buyer wanted to submit backup offer and committed to beat any other offer by $5,000. That's on a backup. Okay. Does this mean the backup offer would be locked into a price at 970? Yeah, it would. In fact, I would probably, if you got an offer like that and I was confused by the language, I would call the buyer's agent and say, look, the current offer is at 965 or whatever the number is. Maybe we're not sharing what the current offer is. I don't believe there's an obligation to at that time, but you can tell the buyer's broker and say, we're going to base your escalation clause on the current primary contract. If you can adjust the language to say that, then let's do it. And I think that's fair. So you would, instead of doing a normal escalation clause, you would be instructing the buyer to say, the purchase price shall be $5,000 more than the current primary agreement dated January 20, or actually it's February. How about that? February 3rd, 2021. And that way we can, be very specific about what offer we're going $5,000 over. And then obviously there's the notice, and we can look at what it means to becoming the primary offer. And we can look at that time. That's when the buyer will know the actual number. Probably something I would want to get my seller to approve if I was sharing the actual price at the moment. So someone else asked, explain the escalation clause gives them money above the highest and best. So highest and best is just a term to say, come with your best, come strong. Well, my strongest could be $5,000 better than anyone else's, right? That could be, I'm escalating over what the other highest and best are. So they're not exclusive to each other. They can be used simultaneous. You can ask for highest and best and get an escalation clause. Christy Webb, good morning. Trickiest part for both seller and buyer when entertaining escalation clause is that home's not appraising in many cases. Waiving appraisal is becoming necessary for the buyer. Exactly. I agree. It is a necessity because you got to prove you're like in that hybrid place between a cash deal and a loan deal. And some of these lenders are getting pretty creative with these products that say you don't need a financing contingency or you don't need an appraisal contingency. That's pretty sharp, but we might be able to do it without one of those types of lenders. We might be able to say, let's waive the appraisal if it's within this range. So here's another one. A conformed copy is only done once you are binding, correct? Yes, that is correct. If we have countered several times and finally agree verbally, but then write up a clean copy at that time, do we need to use 622? No, you wouldn't. Verbal is not a binding contract. So my conformed copy step probably wouldn't apply. It would only be if you had a prior written contract, bound and everything, and then you're doing a clean one of that. But I do love the idea of getting on the phone. Let's talk it through. What do the terms need to be? Great. Let's do that one. I'll send you it right now. That's pretty sweet. Maybe not for everybody, but I love that. I think that's great. Molly asked, so you put the 622 stip in the clean copy? Yes. You're going to put it in the new clean copy. You put that as a special stip because it's referencing the prior binding agreement. All right, Sarah says, I'm confused by not less in option 2. Should be X or less instead of not less. Yeah, let's look at that one. And I could be wrong about what I wrote here. I did this a little bit quickly. If the property appraises for not less than blank below, so I'm looking at a number. Let's say $10,000. That's our number. That's the example we've been giving. So if property appraises for not less than $10,000 below the purchase price, buyer shall be deemed to have waived the appraisal contingency and shall fund the difference between new loan amount and the purchase price. So this is saying as long as it doesn't appraise for less than the 10,000 from purchase. There might be a simpler way to write this. I'll try and think about it, but I think this is accurate. This would be if it appraised at 289, the buyer's not waiving their appraisal contingency. If it appraised for 291, they are waiving their appraisal contingency. Stacy asks, do appraisers see the full contract or just the contract price? I believe they're given the full contract. They may not read it, but they may only be looking for the price. And they may look at like some sort of net. I don't think so, but they realize that the bar they're supposed to hit is the price. They're not supposed to consider the net because the net doesn't help them, doesn't help you get a loan. The appraisal waiver is a special SIP to the original offer. Yes. Just like the escalation clause, I usually put the appraisal waiver right below it. So number 1 is the escalation clause. Number 2 is the appraisal clause. Why not just ask for no appraisal contingency? So Jennifer asked that, and that is in your wheelhouse. You have that option. I went down at the bottom here. You could just waive the contingency altogether. My only point to you would be make sure the buyer, we know what the buyer could actually afford, because it sounds like we're trying to protect the seller in that scenario, but really we're just setting them up for failure. If they're, the purchase price is 300 and we waive the appraisal altogether, they're saying, hey, look, my earnest money is non-refundable even if the appraisal doesn't come in, and it appraises at 282, which is very reasonable in that scenario. The buyer, if the buyer has waived the appraisal and we don't know what the buyer is willing to be able to put down or what they can afford, and we haven't asked it, we're really worried about the appraisal. We're even if you've waived it, it's still a very big concern because we never even had that conversation. Now, if you decide, right, we're just not going to do appraisal, we're going to cross it out, ultimately has the same effect, but I don't think it sets your buyer up in the same way. I don't think it makes you ask the same questions. I don't think it has the buyer double checking how much they can afford. I think it's this like, well, earnest money is non-refundable. That's the risk. I think that's a big risk. If it comes in at 282 and the buyer has to terminate because of it, yeah, it's better for the seller. The earnest money is non-refundable, but now the buyer's in default. They can't close, and they're going to get sued for commissions potentially. There's always that risk. You may never consider it, but I've seen it. I have seen it. Let's see some more. How do multiple escalation clauses affect the purchase price? Okay, I love that question. That is a great question. You can absolutely have 2 or 3 or 4 contracts with the same exact escalation clause, and they end up in the same place. So you've got now 4 offers at 300,000, and you just have to choose the one that you like the best. Maybe you pick one of them out of the pack because you like that agent. You like that lender. They put the clearest, most concise agreement. They called to verify that everything received, that it sounded spectacular. It was just the best, most organized presentation. And I'm going to pick that one out and say, hey, look, we like yours the best. If you can make this one change and let Christian Ross be the closing attorney, we'll do it, right? That always gets the deal done. That's the reality. So ultimately, if you have multiple escalation clauses and they all end up at the same place, you got to pick one. You got to see what the buyer can actually afford. It doesn't just keep going up forever. Most buyers have a breaking point, and we just might maybe have to figure that out. And we have to start thinking about other considerations, temporary occupancy or the option money thing, or let's just like sweeten the deal a little bit. How do we do this? Maybe I'll buy some of your furniture on a separate bill of sale. All right, so let's look at some other questions. If seller defaults and they have the option money, buyer not likely to get that back. That's right. The seller has already been paid that money. I haven't seen that a whole lot, but what I will compare it to is new construction. In new construction, builders, a lot of times they'll ask for a construction deposit. And the form says the construction deposit is to be paid to the builder directly and used to construct the house. Reality is that money's spent. So your buyer has to be realizing that if the seller totally takes advantage of us, or they get a divorce the day of closing or something, we're stuck. That money, I can't guarantee you'll ever get back. You'll have a claim against the seller, but for $2,000, you're not going to court. For $10,000, you might not be going to court. So yeah, the practicalities, that option money is gone, which is also why it's a really wonderful carrot for the seller. Shadi asks, does option money go toward closing at the closing time? It will, if you select the box correctly. So if you look here, you have to select buyer to seller. Either shall or shall not be applied towards the purchase price. So it may or may not be a credit. You just have to select. I would expect you would always put shall be applied towards the purchase price. And actually what that makes me think about is one other thing. We talked about the amount of the option money. We haven't talked about the timing of it, which is very important. You have really 2 or 3 options on timing. It can be due immediately to get under contract, right? So it's due within 1 day of binding agreement date or something like that, or at the time of the binding agreement. So it's due immediately. Obviously, the seller's going to love that. Or let's say you got a 7-day due diligence period. You could make it due day 8, so that your buyer's allowed to do their due diligence, hire their inspector, kind of figure it out. If they want the deal, pay the option money and move on. If you don't want the deal, get out. Now, that doesn't protect the seller for those couple of days, but it does give the buyer the confidence to be able to go in, do their inspection, and not lose a bunch of money just to win out and be, kind of taken advantage of later. So timing is very important. You could make option money paid anytime. I would either say you're either going to do it in the first couple days or after due diligence. That's what I would typically expect. All right, let's keep looking. Option money is non-refundable. That's correct. Option money is non-refundable except in a seller default. So if the seller got a divorce like the day before closing and they can't sell, or they don't have the right to sell, or they go into bankruptcy. I mean, unfortunately, we find that occasionally. I call them ambush title issues. So an ambush bankruptcy where I didn't even know about it, you didn't know about it. We don't close due to ambush, things like that. And so, the buyer would be in a bad spot, seller's in a bad spot, and hopefully we can keep the deal together. All right, it's not clear that option money is only accepted if offer is accepted. Correct. So none of the terms apply to your buyer or seller unless it's a binded contract. So you're just putting it in there. If they accept your terms, then you'll spend the option money, and all those items will apply. I love all these questions. I don't think I'm going to get to all of them. 47, 48 messages. Here we go. Getting the buyer to do option money has been tough. That is a wonderful point. And I haven't spent any time thinking about that yet. As you can tell, you guys have a ton of questions about option money. You had a ton of questions about escalation clauses. And I think that is indicative of how difficult this can be to educate people about what it is. For the people that have used it successfully, I think we should all lean on them to get their advice on how it's disclosed. But if you have a listing agent who has no clue what option money is, and you have no chance of educating them in this short couple-hour time frame, this isn't a carrot. This is a confusion. So you have to know your audience. You have to know your audience. If you have someone that gets it, you could call them and say, Mr. Listing Agent, I was thinking of making an offer that included option money. Would that be something that would be helpful or intriguing to your client? And they say, oh man, we love option money, load us up, then do it. But if they say, well, I don't know what option money is, that sounds confusing, let me go, I gotta pick up my daughter at school or something, then maybe I shy away from it because there's no value to your seller in that case. Careful. Cindy, good morning. So Cindy says, when seller receives option money, should they deposit right away or deposit after the contingencies, or wait, if it closes, give check back, or what do you recommend? Option money is paid to the seller immediately. The seller should deposit it immediately. And, give a copy of that deposited check back to the agent. Now, either buyer or seller should be able to pull an image of that deposited check, because that's going to have to go to the lender. They're going to have to verify that that money was spent. So I had that question this morning. Either party could verify that deposited check. So whether it's the seller that does it or the buyer, it would be fine either way. But they should deposit immediately, because we want to make sure that it actually clears. If it doesn't clear, then this deal is done. I don't want to deal with this buyer anymore. That's useless to me. All right, Kim asked, good question. On appraisal waiver option number 1, contract price is 300. They say they will go 10,000. So property only has to appraise for 290 to still legally close. What if it comes in at 285? Do you have the right to renegotiate the other 5? You do. The appraisal language in the conventional or FHA or VA loan contingency still applies. You'll be able to negotiate it down to that 285. And if the seller doesn't agree, you'll be able to terminate. So the same terms apply. It's just that in that $10,000 piece, you don't have the right to terminate. That appraisal contingency is out the door. Buyers already agreed to fund that difference. Would the broker really sue for commission? What a great question. What if the buyer fights back and accuses the agent of something and goes after your E&O? It is a negotiating tactic to be able to sue for commission. It is a really, really powerful tool. Now, will you actually sue is a totally different question. We're at the poker table. Do I have the good hand, or am I bluffing? You don't know. Your buyer doesn't know. Your seller doesn't know. But hopefully, and this does actually happen, they hold themselves accountable because you have that leverage. You have leverage over them. If they act out, if they do something, fishy, you have some sort of avenue to go after commissions. And maybe you're not going to do it on a $300,000 deal, because I promise you, you're not going to want to spend $30,000 in attorney fees for some, buyer who can't afford to buy a house. That's a waste of time. But if it's a $3 million home and you were going to make 90 grand, you're going to do it. And I would compare it no differently than if you have an exclusive listing and the seller goes and sells it to the neighbor without you. Are you going to sue? You're going to want to. You're going to use that. You're going to bring it up in your conversation with the seller who's trying to screw you. You're going to be very strong about it. So I do see very frequently where the compliance person of the company will send out these demand letters and say, we've been monitoring and we saw that you sold, we had a protected period, you need to pay us this. They do it to you guys. You leave an agency, that agency's looking. Are you sharing commission based on our agreement, or did you cut us out? Are you using clients that were referred to you through our team? I see it. It is very powerful when you send a demand letter of that sort, if you're willing to back it up. All right, I'm going to skip to the bottom. Feel free to sign off. This class and many others are going to be available on YouTube. In fact, it's live streamed right now, so people are able to watch it immediately. Feel free to look at it anytime. Send me an email. Let me know if there are other topics you would love to see. But let's look at a couple of questions. So let's see. Still confused on the waived appraisal situation. I'm in the middle of 13 offers. Holy moly. List price at $465, contract at $490 with 0-day appraisal. So they've waived the appraisal. If appraisal language is not used in the contract and the appraisal comes in at $470, which is $20,000 below the sale price, but above the list price, so that's very realistic. Does the seller still have to pay $495, or does the seller still have to reduce the purchase price if the buyer doesn't agree to move forward with the purchase? Okay, in that scenario, there's no appraisal contingency. So if the buyer can't afford to pay the difference, the deal probably falls apart, because the seller's like, hey, I had 13 other offers. I'm not lowering my price. Get out, leave, right? So the seller's unwilling to negotiate. The buyer is unable to pay the difference. We're at an impasse. You can't get another appraisal. You've waived your appraisal contingency. So at that point, let's say it took 3 weeks to get the appraisal, earnest money is paid. There's no appraisal contingency. Buyer can't move forward. The deal is done. It's dead in the water. So that's a problem. And I would, let's say we compare that to one of your other 13 offers that you had. Say another one was at 485. So it's $5,000 less than the one you accepted. But that 485, the buyer proved to you that they will fund the difference as long as it appraises for the list price. So list price is 475. They offered 485. Let's say they had an escalation clause, and they said, look, as long as it appraises for 465, I'll fund the extra 20 grand in addition to what my down payment was going to be anyways. That is beautiful. Now, yes, sellers possibly leaving 5 grand on the table, but you've got a buyer who's probably more legitimate. So if you instead, you love that offer, you go back to the 490 person, you say, look, you're the highest. It's a wonderful offer. We want to accept it. What can you afford if it doesn't appraise at 490? And the buyer says, I could maybe afford 10 grand. Here's my bank statements. Here's some proof of that. I don't know if that's a good enough offer. I like the idea of taking some risk off the table, because in that other scenario, yeah, 21 days, you get your appraisal. No appraisal contingency. Buyer doesn't actually have to terminate. Maybe they hope for a Hail Mary, maybe then spend the next week or two trying to ask mom and dad to give them a gift. That is painful because the seller can't just put it right back on the market. The seller has to sit there and wait for the contract to terminate and fail. Do your due diligence up front, verify, it's not just the purchase price, as you all know, it's more about what can the buyer afford if this happens, sale contingency or not, or, you're a bank, you're playing underwriter, you're evaluating risk. And luckily, we aren't the decision makers, your clients are. So you empower your client to make these decisions for us. All right, I love this. Let's see. I once threatened to sue for commission, which was to be paid in part with the yellow Corvette. Oh, wow. That was sitting in the seller's garage. He had a fit at the closing table. The closing attorney took him out into the hall and beat him. No, did not beat him up, and assured him that if he did not sign, that car was probably going to be mine. He signed. Yeah, Pat, that's a wonderful story. Holy smokes. That's a lot of fun. That is scary. I'm gonna look at some of the other questions. Robert, hey Robert, would it not be far better to require proof of the other offer upon acceptance via copy? It depends. Just think about what you're gonna get. If I'm sending you proof of another offer, I am redacting any private information such as the buyer's name, their contact information, any of that stuff. I'm redacting all of it. You're not going to see any of it. You're going to see a price. You might see the broker on there. So maybe that's another option. And I think I've thought about this in the past, but instead of getting a copy of the other offer, you ask them, hey, can I verify with the other agent? So if Robert is the one on the other offer, can I call Robert and ask him, yes, was this a third party? Did you make that offer? Can you give me kind of the basic terms? Personally, I don't need to see it. I'm a really good BS detector. I get lied to all day long. I know when someone is hiding something, or if they're unsure, or if I don't really trust it. And, I'm going to give that information to my client to make a decision, but I'd rather just talk them on the phone. Emails and confirmation, there's no guarantees in this world otherwise. Jessica, would it be counterproductive to still include an appraisal contingency when using an escalation clause to protect our buyer client? Absolutely. I want your buyer to have an appraisal contingency. I want your buyer to know what happens if it doesn't appraise. And I want you to ask your buyer if they could afford any of the difference if it doesn't appraise for the full amount. How strict are we on this appraisal? Or is it really just like it would be a blessing if it appraised for the full amount? I ask all of those questions. All right, Kim asks, so if the appraisal is 11,000 under list price, so let's say it comes in at 289, can they get out of the contract entirely or just renegotiate the $1,000? You actually have the full weight of the appraisal contingency at that point. So I believe you could try to renegotiate to come back up, and so if they say, So the buyer at that point has the full arsenal of the appraisal contingency. It comes in at 289. So the buyer goes back to the seller and says, hey, I want you to come down to 289. And the seller says, I'm not doing that. He says, well, then I'm out. You don't have to just do the 1,000. All right, Dan, I order to get a clean copy with lots of back and forth. I've simply had a new clean copy contract signed without using 622, and every agent I've dealt with does the same thing. So should we have been using 622 language all this time? Yeah, I think we should use 622 all this time. It's been in there for a while for a purpose. And I experienced it firsthand. I saw where the agent made a mistake. And I have a feeling that for a short period, there was a major concern that the agent was going to have to cover the $10,000 difference. I wasn't going to let it be that way, but I know there was a concern, and I would hate for you to have that same like heart-stopping moment. It's just brutal. Rita asks, how would these appraisal waivers or special SIPs work with an FHA or VA loan? Can you use these options with these types of loans? Yeah, that's a great question. I think you can, but like in FHA especially, you can basically remove the appraisal contingency and say you'll fund the difference. On a VA loan, it may not be able to get away with it. The VA is still going to allow the earnest money to be refunded to the buyer if it doesn't appraise, because federal law and the VA protections are pretty stout. However, we could compensate with that with option money. Say, hey, look, I've got 20,000 of option money. I'm going to put it down. It's non-refundable. I know the VA lets me get earnest money back, but I don't have any earnest money. Just like, I'm legit. This is as good as it gets. So I think we just have to be considerate. But Rita, that is a wonderful question. That means you get it. You get it. FHA and V loans are different than conventional. B says, if buyer agrees to waive appraisal, but in the end they cannot afford the difference, can buyer back out of the contract with a loan rejection letter since they can't afford the down payment plus the extra money? When it is within loan contingency, can the buyer get the earnest money back? No, they are separate. If you think about your appraisal and financing contingencies, they are separate paragraphs. You could fail under one, you could fail under the other, but if you've already waived the appraisal contingency, you can't terminate under the financing contingency because of the appraisal. They are very separate. Now, there are some lenders who may bend the rules and may do a nondescript denial letter and said they were denied for income purposes. I can't protect you against that from a lender, basically protecting a buyer. But no, generally you could not terminate a contract and get your money back if you had already waived the appraisal and then tried to terminate it under the financing contingency due to the appraisal. Once you waive the appraisal, you can't use that as your excuse anymore. Rebecca, great question. Can we ask to see proof of funds? Absolutely. In fact, if you take anything from this, I would hope that you would understand that we, as the buyer's agent and seller agent, should ask the buyer to prove what they can really afford. You're offering us $500,000. The list price was only $450,000. Can you really afford this? Where's your 50 grand in addition to the down payment? Where's the money? Show it to me. It's a hybrid between a cash deal and a loan. Let's do proof of funds. I think that would be very appropriate. This class is a lot of fun. I'm really enjoying all these questions. But you feel free to back out to leave. We'll probably stay on for another 5 minutes, see if I can answer any other questions. Jennifer asked, to clarify at closing, is it an option for the seller to keep the option money or credit that amount on the buyer's settlement statement? It's an option. If we look at this cutout here, you either select box 1 or box 2, either it shall or shall not be applied towards the purchase price at closing. And just keep in mind that whatever option money is paid, we just need a check image, and that needs to be sent to the lender. But yeah, it's an option. I would say most times the buyer is going to choose that it is credited to them at closing. All right, let's see, I'm gonna take one other question. When looking at a cash proof of funds, maybe consider if investment portfolio can stay valid if market takes a 20% hit. So keep in mind, that's a great point. That is a great point. If they're showing proof of funds in a mutual fund or some sort of stock options or something, it's very volatile potentially. And so two things. One, awesome, they have the money, make them liquidate it. If they're using that for closing, they need to get out of it because we're closing in the next 3 weeks. You need to take the money off the table, keep it safe. Once you've won the game, this is a Warren Buffett quote. Once you've won the game, quit. So take your money out of the market if you're depending on that. And you know, if you've got tons of money, then maybe we don't have to worry so much. But I've seen where it takes a week to come out of a mutual fund or out of a brokerage account or an IRA and then gets sent to the buyer. If you need to plan for this stuff ahead of time, I take money off the table a year before closing because I could never explain to my wife why I didn't have the money to close because it was, you know, the market dropped 5% or 20% or whatever it is. So just be very, very careful there. I'm actually going to probably log off at this point. So thank you so much for joining. I'm going to try and do these regular. We had them last year. Check on YouTube for more of these videos. Email me if you have questions. Call me. So excited that you enjoy this format. And my hope is that I'll see all of you soon. Please come close with me, close with our office. If you need anything at Campbell Brannon, use me as your point of contact. I'll direct you to the right place. So I'm in East Cobb. But if you want to do a deal in Buckhead, I'll set you up with Whit or Robin or some of the other wonderful attorneys we have in this firm. So use our website. We have fee calculators. Email us if you have questions. But thank you. Stay safe. God bless.